Welcome back to Young Heretics. This is a big one. You guys have been asking for this for a while, and I cannot wait to deliver. So we are back now to T.S. Eliot, the great modernist poet of the years between the wars. Back in the day, folks that have been with this show for a while will remember that we did the most depressing episode of Young Heretics ever on T.S. Eliot, because his early, well, not even early, but just a lot of his modernist stuff is incredibly bleak and sad. It's about what is sometimes called the lost generation, or the generation in between the two world wars. And back then, when we did actually 2 episodes on the wasteland. And I said that one of the things Eliot lets us do is he lets us track a literary conversion, because he was in the public eye both before and after his conversion to Anglican Christianity. And one of the ways that we can kind of understand what Christianity meant to him is by studying his work before and after that conversion. So now we are back to T.S. Eliot, and after having done 2 episodes on the wasteland, we're going to do 2 episodes now on 4 quartets, which is kind of his last great work, and it is known as his Christian work. And folks have been kind of excited on Twitter to talk about it. I'm very excited. I think this is a tremendously beautiful and sort of fascinating development in Eliot's life. This is a series of 4 poems that Eliot wrote after he became a Christian. They are his fullest, I think, and deepest poetic expression of his Christianity. He published them between the years of 1936 and 1942. So the Second World War broke out during those years, and Eliot is basically providing to us this kind of last great statement. He's been through the hell of the despair of the interwar years. He's been through a conversion to Christianity. He has written some other Christian poetry, which we'll get to, and then out comes this sort of last great work of Eliot's. Usually in these shows, when I start talking about something, I start by telling you kind of the big takeaway that I hope we're going to get out of whatever work of Western culture we're delving into. This time, these poems are so rich and so full that I wanted to find a way to kind of let Eliot speak for himself about what we should get out of them. So here's what I will do. I'm going to read to you from a letter that Eliot wrote in 1931. So before he wrote these poems, but relevant to what comes out of the poems. Eliot says, "There is a sort of heavenly gaiety about some of Beethoven's later things, or some of Beethoven's later music, which one imagines might come to oneself as the fruit of reconciliation and relief after immense suffering. I should like to get something of that into verse before I die." So that's what Eliot is reaching for here. He has been through this a very unpleasant life. Remember, he was a sickly child. He had a nervous breakdown, which we'll get to talking about in a second. He had this conversion. He lived through some of Europe's greatest turmoil, the turmoil of the First World War and then eventually the Second. And he was trying here to find and to express the joy that comes, he says, from reconciliation and relief after immense suffering. I think that this is kind of the joy that Jesus called the peace which passes understanding, right? And when we did The Wasteland, I talked about how important it is to kind of engage with that poem without trying to make up happy talk about it, right? We always want, especially I think in American Christianity, sometimes we have this excess that we just want everything to end in a neat packaged way with a bow. And you really can't, that's really, without being honest about the reality of sin and the reality of despair in the world, you can't get to a joy that stands on a solid foundation. That's why when Jesus says the peace which passes understanding, he's talking about that joy that does not ignore suffering, but actually passes through it and sits so deeply with it that it's able to find some deeper music and harmony in the universe. And that's, to me, what these poems are about. It's something that we need right now because people, whatever, again, I've said this before, whatever your political beliefs are, if you're looking out into the world and thinking that everything is hunky-dory, you have blinders on. I mean, this is a time of tremendous uncertainty. A lot of people are worried about losing their jobs, losing their family. These are deep and troubling concerns and anxieties which we're not always used to dealing with, I think, in a prosperous country like America. And so we think that joy is like bunnies and sort of forgetting about the world outside. But Eliot knew, and Christ himself knew, and we are going to find out that that is not what joy is. That might be what kind of happiness is sometimes, but joy, Christian joy, is the joy of the desert fathers, right? These are these early Christians that sought God through fasting and asceticism, right? This sort of just denial of the self. And Eliot, in his typical fashion in Four Quartets, doesn't give you any kind of, easy answers to anything. And this poem is sort of rich with the joy that comes from accepting suffering and seeing beyond it, seeing through and past it without trying to deny it. So that's what these two episodes are going to be about, and especially this first one, how Eliot made his way into that kind of joy. When we talked about The Wasteland, which, remember, that was published in the 1920s, so in between the war, we noted kind of how unhappy Eliot was when he wrote those poems. He was in a miserable marriage with his first wife, Vivienne. And he said that marriage contributed to the state of mind that made this very despairing poem. He had a nervous breakdown, of what you would now call a nervous breakdown, and he was just fitful with this spirit of discontent in between the wars. And in Four Quartets, Eliot looks back on that time a little bit in the second poem. Remember, there's 4 poems. The second poem is called East Coker, and in its 5th movement, we'll talk in a bit about the movements of the poems, but in the 5th movement of East Coker, Eliot says this: "So here I am in the middle way, having had 20 years largely wasted, the years of l'entre-deux-guerres," and that's a French for between the two wars, right? "Trying to use words, and every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure." So this is a reference, in the middle way is a reference to a lot of stuff, but it's chiefly, I think, a reference to Dante, the great Italian epic poet who wrote about his dream, his imagined journey through the underworld. And at the very beginning of that journey, he says he's nel mezzo, in the middle of the path of life. And so Eliot is saying, here I am in the middle way, kind of caught between two wars, having spent so much of my career reaching to express things with language that evaded my grasp and evaded my ability to express them. Incapable, really, of capturing in words what he wants captured. But the thing to remember, right, about that reference in Four Quartets is that Dante, in that poem, eventually ascends into heaven and sees heaven as well. And this is something we forget. We tend to think about Dante's Inferno because it's very fun and sexy and there's lots of hell and dying and death. It's cool. But in fact, there are 3 parts to the Divine Comedy. And there's not just hell, there's purgatory, and then there's paradise. And Eliot, I think, is suggesting here that he's come through this interwar period of deep despair and modernism, and the hope that was kind of glinting only at the outside, at the edge of the wasteland, is now going to kind of come center stage. At this point in Eliot's life, he's in a better place. He had left Vivienne in 1933, and she was subsequently committed to a mental hospital. So she was really, it's a tragic story, her life. And he basically separated with her, formally separated with her, but she remained his wife until she died in 1947. But the separation was kind of, seems to have been the right thing for both of them. And this is, people will have different kind of moral opinions about this. And I pass over it really without saying too much. He had a series of other affairs during this time, and he wasn't actually formally remarried until later in 1957 when he was 68. He married a woman named Esme Valerie Fletcher, and she was 30. So again, I'm not here actually really to pass moral judgment on this aspect of Eliot's life. It was tremendously troubled and difficult for him, but I mention it only to say that he has moved sort of beyond and out of the cloying personal world that produced The Wasteland. And possibly, that's important, but possibly even more important than that is that in 1927, he had made his great conversion to Anglican Christianity. I say great, it was actually kind of quiet. He kind of went off quietly and converted to Christianity. And it perplexed his trendy modernist friends, which I think a lot of people who have converted to Christianity have found this, that you get stuck in with one set of people who have these kind of trendy sets of assumptions that Christianity is all debunked and, religion is for weird, superstitious people. And then suddenly, and we talked about this earlier, suddenly some of the smartest people and the greatest literary artists during this time were thinking, actually, there's something to this Christianity business. And we will see in Four Quartets why it was that was the case, that Eliot, so lost as he was in the kind of despair of modernism, was finding answers in the supernatural and specifically in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So he makes his conversion. He doesn't hide it. He writes publicly about it. And his modernist friends, I'm thinking here of Ezra Pound, who was a huge part of the Wasteland, but also of people like Gertrude Stein, these big names in kind of the modernist movement between the wars. His poetry becomes increasingly sort of weird to them. They don't get it anymore the way that they got his bleak, dark Wasteland poetry. And it starts to kind of separate him from that set, and he goes through a period of writing religious poems. The Journey of the Magi is one of his famous poems from this period. That's 27, so that's the year he converts. But he also writes Ash Wednesday, which is obviously the name of a big Christian holy day. And then sort of subsequently, he starts writing plays. He goes through a time where he sort of doesn't write so much poetry. He writes plays. The most famous one of his plays is Murder in the Cathedral. That's in 1935. And then, as the Second War hits, he says it's actually no longer practical to write plays. I assume that this is because it's just the war effort is taking up all the energy and financial investment in Britain at this time, and in America as well, for that matter, of course. So he stops writing plays and returns basically to poetry. And the reason I mention this is because the first of the Four Quartets, the first poem, which is called Burnt Norton, is a poem that grows out of discarded lines that he couldn't work into Murder in the Cathedral. He couldn't get them into his play. And so he kind of develops them into this lyric poem. And he kind of thinks at this point that it's a one-off. He thinks he's just writing one of these, one poem and will go on to write others. But then as he starts writing the second poem, East Coker, he realizes that it actually repeats a bunch of patterns that were in Burnt Norton. It's a really interesting artistic process here. And he also realizes at that point that the patterns will repeat for two more poems. There will be a total of 4 poems. And I think at this point, fascinatingly, he's starting to realize that this is going to be where he captures that Beethoven joy, right? That sort of peace that comes after suffering. And so this is a wonderfully sort of organic poem. It develops organically and becomes this collection of 4. And out of that structure, that patterning, he constructs this magisterial edifice. And that's really, and it's kind of the first thing you have to understand about these poems. The Wasteland is so dense with allusion, right? With references to other stuff. And we talked about this. We talked about it's this kind of hyper-modernist fragments I have shored against my ruin. And you have to constantly refer to the notes to figure out kind of what he's referring to. That happens in Four Quartets. I just read that portion, which has a little reference to Dante in it. There's lots sort of here that you can follow these paths of his references. But whereas with The Wasteland, those references are the poem in many ways. With Four Quartets, it's something slightly different. The major thing in Four Quartets is actually understanding the structure and the patterns, because one of the central themes here for Eliot is that he feels he has seen through the chaos of modern life to find a kind of hidden pattern that undergirds the whole cosmos. It's like this secret language that he feels he's cracked that says, yes, there is this suffering. Yes, there are things that look random. But if you can just see beyond this moment of despair, you would see that the whole thing is orchestrated into this vast kind of musical and wonderfully organized pattern. And he expresses that in the structure of the poems themselves. So that's the first thing that we're really going to talk about here in this first episode about the Four Quartets. Before I leap into it, I'm just going to say, as I often do, thank you so much for being here with me. This is always a joy to talk to you on the show. If you have not already, if you're joining us now for the first time, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes, Apple Play, Google Play, rather, and so forth. And then leave us a 5-star review. That really helps the show, and I love reading them. I love reading people's engagements with the show. So as I always say, leave us a 5-star review, or at least keep your bad opinions to yourself. Each of these poems, and remember again, there's 4 poems. Each of these poems has 5 movements. And that was actually true of The Wasteland as well. They're divided up into these 5 different sections. And each poem as a whole, each of the 4 poems, focuses on a series of 4 things. So it's like these interlocking wheels of 4s and 5s, which is really kind of amazing to think about how he did it, especially because he was figuring it out like as he went along, which kind of boggles my mind. But so for example, and we will get into other ways that this is true in the future, these 4 poems are called Burnt Norton, East Coker, The Dry Salvages, and Little Gidding. So those are the four names of the 4 poems. And each one of them is associated with a different element. Burnt Norton is a lot about air. East Coker is about earth. The Dry Salvages is water. And Little Gidding is fire. And so that's just an example of how he kind of cycles through these 4 elemental patterns, which for, ages past in many civilizations have been thought of as kind of the 4 fundaments of creation and of reality. Another way that this is true is that the 4th movement of each poem is about some part of the Godhead. So there's one devoted to each member of the Trinity, and then there's one devoted to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so that's another way, again, in which he kind of cycles through these core elements of what he believes to be the ultimate reality, beyond and behind and around the reality that we perceive every day. As I said, we're going to come back as we go through to other ways in which this is true, other groups and groupings of 4. But the major thing to note just here at the outset is that this is not a linear progression. This is, of all the poems that we've talked about, this is one to read again and again, because it's not just 1, 2, 3, 4. It's kind of a wheel. It's like these sort of 4 poems interlocking with one another. And the ways that those patterns interlock are part of the poem. This is structure begetting meaning, structure giving to you what words couldn't quite say. And as you come to see how these things fall into place, it kind of mimics the way Eliot is seeing things in the world fall into place. The justice of heaven and the arc of creation sort of falls into place in his view as the poem falls into place in your view. The closest analogy to this is music. And remember, we started with Beethoven, right? And a quartet, in fact, is in music. It's a piece of music written for 4 instruments. And so Eliot is thinking here, as he often is, about poetry as a kind of music all its own. So he's writing, and again, in a piece of music, even though it proceeds through time, it begins at the beginning and moves to the end, you also have these kind of recurring movements oftentimes, right, that come back again, and they develop, they take on meaning sort of as they go. That's how 4 quartets works. A lot of people, again, Eliot is really hard to understand a lot of times, and people kind of open this thing and they're like, what the hell is it? And they don't, one of the reasons that happens is because, they think of it as something you have to just read once and be done with. That's kind of not what this is. This is like this finely cut gemstone to hold in your hands and just carry with you in your pocket throughout life and pull it back out and be like, oh yeah, that's how that works. So that's going to be our route into the heart of this poem, and especially into the part of it that I want to talk about today, which is time. Eliot is obsessed in this poem with time, the passage of time and how time works. And there's a central passage, which again, I'm not going to start at the beginning. I'm going to reach here into the middle and give us a central passage from the Dry Salvages, the 5th movement. So again, remember, Dry Salvages, right, is the 3rd poem in the sequence of 4, and this is the 5th movement of Dry Salvages. The point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death in love. Ardor and selflessness and self-surrender. For most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, the distraction fit, lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, or the winter lightning, or the waterfall, or music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all. But you are the music, while the music lasts. These are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses, and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. Ah, yes, good old incomprehensible Elliot. What the hell does he mean? It's very beautiful as always. It has a wonderful sort of rhythm, and it's easy to get lost in it. That's part of the point, that it's easy to get lost in it. But it also perplexes people. So what is he talking about here? He's talking about something that is central both to the Western tradition that we talk about on this show and to the Eastern tradition with which, remember, Eliot was deeply engaged as a graduate student and as an academic. He had studied Sanskrit. He studied Buddhist scripture. We quoted previously from the Pali Canon, which is one of the sort of central scriptures of Buddhism. And he's concerned here also with Hinduism. And all of these traditions, not just the Western tradition, have some sense that the way that we experience time, this kind of linear time, is only a very tip of the iceberg part of the picture, that we are traveling here along a vast ocean, which has its own kind of immensity beyond our sight. And Eliot thinks that there are kind of those two realms. And that's where he begins this passage that I just read, the point of intersection of the timeless with time. And this timeless obviously is where God lives, right? God's realm is eternity beyond all time. And the saint, he says, is the one who is able, it's given to saints to kind of live in that space, to always see how our world is just a little offshoot of this deeper and bigger world. But for most of us, he says, for the rest of us, they're just these moments, these flickers, when you're listening to music and you get lost in it so deeply that the music is you and you are the music. This sounds kooky, but I hope we've all had moments something like this. I know I have. I remember so vividly the first moment like this, at least in my adult life. I think we have this a lot more when we're kids, actually. But in my adult life, the first time this happened, I was listening to a service of evensong, which is the Anglican tradition, which, again, Eliot would have experienced evensong as well. It's this beautiful sort of sung church service. And I was in Westminster Cathedral, which is one of the great churches of Britain. And there was a point in time, and the funny thing about these moments is you can only remember them in retrospect, because part of what they do is they carry you out of our normal modes of experience. This kind of literally ecstatic, the Greek word meaning outside of your bodies, out of body experiences. And I remember just sort of suddenly coming to realize that I had, for the past however long, I had had no idea that there was time or that there was music. It was just kind of this full immersion in an artistic experience. And Eliot is saying that peering so deeply into reality that you kind of pass through your temporal experience, that is this thing that's given to saints, and glimpses of it are given to us in the midst of our prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. So you can't get there unless you're having kind of a daily regimen or ritual of prayer and discipline, but those moments kind of seed the ground for these spontaneous gifts of vision beyond time. Now, for Eliot, time is kind of the sign of modernity. Modernity is all about time, and he's obsessed. At one point, he talks about we get distracted from distraction by distraction, which is something very familiar to us today. I think we talk about this with iPhones all the time, but Eliot talks about it on the tube. He has these visions, the trains, the underground trains in London. He has these visions, this kind of cloying sense that you're just stuck in one moment after another. And that harkens back to the wasteland as well, right? But there are these sort of glimpses, these sudden moments when, unbeknownst to you, you've been carried out of that and your perception has reached beyond time. I am going now to just bring out a couple references here to help illuminate what we're talking about and to situate it within the broader Western tradition. There's one book that's particularly on Eliot's mind here, I think, and that is St. Augustine's Confessions, especially Book 11, which is kind of books in Confessions like chapters, like Book 11 of Augustine's Confession. So St. Augustine, right, 354 to 430 AD, the early Christian saint. He's the bishop of Hippo, and he gives his account in Confessions of his conversion to faith, which of course has been a big thing for Eliot as well. And then after he gives that account, of this sort of autobiographical account, he turns to contemplating the mysteries of the universe, these sort of deep philosophical questions. And even behind Augustine, I think there is a kind of Aristotelian or perhaps Platonic, these are Greek view of how time works. Because Aristotle, as we will discuss in a different episode, Aristotle was very concerned also with what time was. Very strange thing, time, when you get around to it. And here is what Augustine says in Book 11 of Confessions. He says, in whatever manner this secret preconception of future things may be, he's talking here about sort of when you think about when you imagine the future, what are you really imagining? Because it hasn't happened yet, it might not happen. What is the reality of that? He says, nothing can be seen save what is. But, Augustine goes on, what now is not future, but present. When, therefore, they say that things future are seen, it is not themselves, which as yet are not, that is, which are future, but their causes or their signs are perhaps seen, which already are. Therefore, to those already beholding them, they are not future, but present, from which future things conceived in the mind are foretold. Let now so multitudinous variety of things afford me some example. I behold daybreak. Augustine is talking here about how you think about the future. I behold daybreak. I foretell that the sun is about to rise. That which I behold is present. What I foretell is future. Not that the sun is future, which already is, but his rising, which is not yet. So there's a whole book of this. So be grateful that I'm just excerpting this little piece. No, but you actually should go away and read Confessions. It's very rich and profound on this topic. But what Augustine is saying here is that past and future are in themselves part of the present in the human mind. And the human mind, which we don't think about this, is this insane apparatus for containing actually the entire timeline, which nowhere exists except in this one present moment, which gathers everything into one. And Eliot is sort of obsessed with this. He talks about time present and time past are both perhaps contained in time future. He's sort of thinking about the way in which, if you really contemplate your experience, you will find that it is not linear in the way that you sort of think it is, but gathers all of time into one. And that's kind of his route into getting out of modernity. It's his way of saying we don't have to just be moving from one moment to the next. We have this incredible tool, which is the human mind, that is created by God to encapsulate the whole thing, to go much, much deeper than just this present moment into these out of body, out of time experiences. I'm gonna talk about the sort of Eastern part of this tradition in just a second, but that's the sort of Western influence here that is on Eliot is Augustine and his Confessions. The first poem, so now we'll go to the beginning of Four Quartets and kind of, now that we've understood what he's talking about here a little bit, the first poem contains a mystical experience exactly like this and tries to kind of get it down in words. And you can see why Eliot is talking. I quoted at the beginning that moment where he talks about the incapacity of language, because language is constantly kind of lagging behind your experience. And this stuff is so trippy that you kind of can't quite get it in words. And Eliot is trying here to get a kind of verbal music that evokes this experience. So in Burnt Norton, that first one, he describes this kind of mystical experience which he had in the garden of a manor. Burnt Norton is the name of a ruined manor house that Eliot visited. And he says, other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow? Quick, said the bird, find them round the corner, through the first gate, into our first world. Shall we follow the deception of the thrush into our first world? There they were, dignified, invisible, moving without pressure, over the dead leaves in the autumn heat, through the vibrant air, and the bird called in response to the unheard music, hidden in the shrubbery, and the unseen eye-beam crossed, for the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. There they were, as our guests, accepted and accepting. So we moved, and they, in a formal pattern, along the empty alley into the box circle to look down into the drained pool. The pool, dry concrete, brown-edged, and the pool was filled with water out of sunlight, and the lotus rose quietly, the surface glittered out of heart of light, and they were behind us, reflected in the pool. Then a cloud passed, and the pool was empty. Go, said the bird, for the leaves were full of children, hidden excitedly, containing laughter. Go, 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 said the bird. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. It's one of the great lines in this poem. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. When you really conceive what it is to have past, present, and future contained in your mind, you are so much more. You are such a divine, bizarre creation, right? The psalmist says, I praise you for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. It is fearful to kind of encounter this ability to look beyond time. And Eliot has this wonderful, again, he's only able to get it in kind of shadows and glimpses that there are this unnamed they and these children. And you look into an empty pool and suddenly the pool is full of water and there are figures reflected behind you. It's like, it's both a beautiful vision and a horror movie. You know, like there's this scene in the horror movie where you close your bathroom mirror and there's like somebody standing behind you. That's kind of what he's getting at here, except in this tremendously aching sense that there is something here that is more real than our regular experience. Go, go, said the bird, humankind cannot bear very much reality, time past and time future. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. You can hear Augustine there, right? This containment of all time in one moment. These are these sudden moments that we're talking about. And again, I hope that you have had some experience that's related to this, so that I'm not just talking about something you've never felt, but maybe you have had this experience and never known what it was. And one of the genius and magnificent things that Eliot does here is he puts that experience into some form of language so that we can recognize it and say like, oh, wow, I've actually kind of had that. If you know what he's talking about, if he's not just talking gibberish, then you kind of recognize that in those moments you're seeing through to something, some deeper reality of the world. But what is that deeper reality, right? That's kind of the next question. We haven't even gotten to that. We've just been talking about the mechanism of time. But in this same first poem, Eliot gives us a glimpse of kind of what that deeper reality is. And I'm going to read again another passage, and then it takes some explaining because there's references in here that aren't obvious. So another one of my favorite lines: garlic and sapphires in the mud clot the bedded Axel Tree. The trilling wire in the blood sings below inveterate scars, appeasing long-forgotten wars. The dance along the artery, the circulation of the lymph, are figured in the drift of stars. Ascend to summer in the tree, we move above the moving tree in light upon the figured leaf, and here upon the sodden floor below, the boarhound and the boar pursue their pattern as before, but reconciled among the stars. So again, very lovely. What the hell does it mean? Well, this is, in some sense, this is ancient wisdom. This is contained especially in Plato's dialogue, the Timaeus. It's one of the great works of ancient Greek philosophy. It was kind of lost. This Timaeus, this idea that the patterning of the cosmos, the way that the stars move and the planets move, is kind of recreated in microcosm in the human person. And Eliot gets at it here by saying the circulation of the lymph, the dance along the artery, are figured in the drift of stars. The stars move in the way that your blood moves through your veins, which is a very evocative image, and one that we are kind of tend to sort of dismiss out of hand because we have all these sort of scientific ideas that's all random. But actually, if you think about it in terms of this consciousness and perception thing that we've been talking about, the fact that that whole world out there, right, everything that you see, of course, we believe it somehow exists objectively outside of you, but for you, it all exists in your mind. This is another sort of thing that Augustine is obsessed over, that your brain, between your ears, contains a perception and an experience which encompasses not just the entire vista of the world, but everything that you can imagine, right, exists within this sort of space. And the Greeks, many of the Greeks, Thales is sort of a lost Greek philosopher, is thought to have sort of observed this, that the human mind, the magical and amazing thing about human consciousness is that it's self-aware. And so it gathers into itself all of the world. We're kind of this microcosm of what goes on outside. And so this is where Eliot gets this idea of these sort of things dancing around in a circle. At another point, he talked about the still point of the turning world, the kind of still center of a circle that is moving. And that Axel Tree, which it's easy to miss. This is actually a reference to Norse mythology, of all things. In Norse mythology, the Axel Tree stands at the center of 9 different realms, kind of almost these alternate universes. And so this is this idea of this central point around which revolve these unknown and unheard and unseen other realms. It's, again, tremendously evocative. But what in the world does all of this have to do with God, right? So this is the next thing that we've gotten. Where have we gotten so far with this poem? Well, we've gotten to the idea that our minds contain the whole patterning of the cosmos in miniature. And we've gotten to the idea that in these moments where we kind of step outside of time, we can kind of grasp the reality of that and see it for what it really is, as opposed to kind of our bare fragmentary experience of real human time. But what does any of this have to do with God? Well, for Eliot, the intersection of that timeless universe with the universe that proceeds in time, this kind of bounded time universe, the most full version of that is the incarnation of Christ. And this comes really from the Gospel of John, where he says, the Word was with God before all ages, but the Word was made flesh. And Eliot thinks of this as just impossible and yet real. And we know it's real because we have these experiences where the infinite and the time beyond time kind of connects with our world. And Eliot thinks this is made possible because of this kind of intersection between God the Father, who is beyond all speech, thought, time, human perception, and God the Son, who enters into this particular man, this particular flesh, this way of walking about these 33 years on earth, right? And this is, Eliot thinks this is impossible, and yet it has happened. And so here's a piece from the Dry Salvages, which is actually right after that part of the Dry Salvages that I just quoted. So here's what he says to end the Dry Salvages. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood, is incarnation. Here, the impossible union of spheres of existence is actual. Here the past and future are conquered and reconciled, where action were otherwise movement of that which has only moved and has in it no source of movement, driven by daimonic, chthonic powers. Chthonic is coming from the earth, just by the way, great word. Daimonic, chthonic powers, and right action is freedom from past and future also for most of us. This is the aim, never here to be realized. Who are only undefeated because we have gone on trying. We, content at the last, if our temporal reversion nourish not too far from the yew tree, the life of significant soil. So here he is saying, basically, the incarnation is a reality that shouldn't have been possible and yet was, because with God, of course, all things are possible. This is at once an incredibly profound vision of the incarnation, and one that actually relies, it's on the edges of your experience, but actually relies on realities of your experience. If you think through them philosophically, holds together that your mind contains sort of all of this patterning, and that the patterning itself is kind of the message. And this is, again, how Eliot is able to understand his own suffering and his own moving through this cramped, distracted world of modernity between the wars. He says, it was in that time, that world of sin and time, that I finally, by investing fully in my experience, saw something bigger and beyond. And the incarnation is where all of that infinitude gets just compressed down into one human person whom you can know and talk to and read about, right? That's why evangelicals get so excited about Jesus, right? It's because he's supposed to be this vast compression. He is this vast compression of eternity into a person and into something that we, in our time-bound way, can kind of grasp. And Eliot says, we're always kind of trying. We never fully get there on this earth, but we are content at the last if our temporal reversion nourish not too far from the yew tree, the life of significant soil. What on earth does that mean? Well, yew trees are trees that grow in and around English cemeteries, especially. So he's talking here about our temporal reversion that's going back into the dirt, right? That's your dirt nap. And then we're content if we nourish the life of significant soil. So the thing for Eliot that most kind of embodies this cyclical notion of time is coming back to is the cycle of life, right? Is dying and going to the ground and nourishing more life. What I want to note about that is that it actually comes back to the thing that we were talking about, with the hint, the hope that we were talking about in The Wasteland, when we had all those, those ideas of corpses under the sea, right? Those are pearls that were his eyes, this quote of Shakespeare that he kept bringing back. This idea that corpses can sprout roots. At the time, it was just kind of this macabre, gruesome inkling of an idea. Now for Eliot, it is the great symbol of death and resurrection. And he's saying, yes, it is actually possible. Yes, your death is not just, it's not the end, it's the beginning. And we're going to get in the next episode into the whole thing about "in my end is my beginning," which is another big part of this poem. But in some sense, we have here this idea which Paul in the epistles gets at by talking about spirits in clay jars, the idea that all of this abstraction and this time beyond time and all this stuff is now encapsulated in this mud and dirt and flesh and this matter. And that's why he talks about the impossibility of language, right? Because this is the best example of the whole thing, that we use these grunts, these weird animal noises, basically. Flaubert, the French author, called them, a tune that a bear beats out on a cracked jar when he wants to make the stars weep. So this idea that you're trying here to encapsulate eternal things like love into these very temporal, very animal features of your own body. And that's possible. Again, that's possible for Eliot because incarnation is real. Consider this, and this is where I will leave you until next time, until we come back to these poems. The world at the moment wants to tell you that human time is reality and eternal time, infinite time, is an illusion. That there's moments, like my moment in the church when I, was listening to evensong, that those moments are these kind of brain farts, basically. This is the Freudian idea that out of your base physical animal urges and grunts and desires and hungers, sometimes the mind constructs abstract stories for itself to justify its sort of primal urges. And so that's basically what we're talking about here. But what if that's exactly backwards? What if that is literally the inversion of what's true? What if this whole thing, as basically every tradition ever before Freud has thought, what if this whole thing is it not an illusion, but this again, I said the tip of the iceberg, right? The barest kind of inkling into inclination of what's really going on. So this is where I bring, again, we will talk at a certain point, Eliot refers to Krishna, who is the Hindu god that sort of dances at the center of the universe. And that, again, every major wisdom tradition, every major philosophical tradition, people much, much smarter than me have thought this is the real thing. This is what's real. And this other stuff is just, that the brain fart is the here and now. That's the thing where we're kind of having to grasp just distantly through the clouded vision of sin, through to reality. What if that's true? What if what Eliot really hears is the real music of the spheres? Obviously, I think that's the case. And so I'm going to leave you with that thought for now, and then we'll come back and do a second episode because there's so much more in this poem that I want to get to, especially I want to get to the vision of God in this poem because we haven't really grasped those parts of the poem that actually deal with God and the Trinity. But before we close out, I will just shift into the mailbag to answer one of your excellent mailbag questions. Thank you so much for all the mailbag questions that you send me on Twitter, especially. It's nice to have you tweet them at me with the hashtag #YoungHeretics. But you can send them to me any way you want. I'll see them. Here's one that I've been getting a lot recently. Everybody wants a classical reading list. Everybody wants a kind of list of things that they need to read that they can just grasp the basics, the essential stuff. And I do want to do this in a more fulsome way at some point. I want to give you kind of an authoritative reading list or something, at least to get you started. I was just chatting with one of our guests for another episode, Stephen Limbaugh, about how he wants to retire to a mansion in Scotland and read like 50 books that will get him to know everything. And I think that's a very admirable goal. But let us start a little smaller. Let me give you the 5 works that I think you can read to just get the most basic grounding that you need that will orient you to the rest of the stuff, right? These are not even my favorite works. These are not even the ones that I think in every case are the best, but they're the ones that people refer to most, that had the biggest influence on the development of Western thought and culture. And so they're the ones that by reading, you can really get your foot in the door. If you feel like all of the stuff we talk about here is awesome, but you don't really have a sense of it all as a whole, these are the ones that you can, I think, kind of read to ground yourself and move forward from there. First one is the Gospels, the 4 Gospels. Yeah, really, you should read the whole King James Bible because the King James translation of the Bible is as influential as Shakespeare in shaping the English language, in addition to shaping the mind of the sort of Anglophone West, the English-speaking West. But read at least the Gospels and read them in the KJV, the King James, or the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. And along with those 4 Gospels, read 4 very short dialogues by Plato. So I'm cheating a little bit here, but these come together as a whole. So 4 Gospels and 4 dialogues by Plato: the Apology, the Crito, the Phaedo, and the Euthyphro. And these will give you, again, a grounding kind of how Plato works and how the baseline for where Western philosophy kind of got its start. Then read the Aeneid. And here's an example of one that is definitely not my favorite. The Aeneid is an epic poem by Virgil from the Augustine period, so the early period of the Roman Empire. It is not my favorite epic poem. The Iliad is my favorite epic poem. But the Aeneid is the one, first of all, the Aeneid gathers the Iliad and the Odyssey up and kind of makes reference to it over and over again and kind of recycles Homer in this interesting way. And so you'll kind of get a little taste of that from the Aeneid, but you'll also get all the stuff, Virgil was Dante's touchstone. He kept coming back to it. And so the other thing you should read next is Dante's Inferno, or ideally, again, the whole Divine Comedy, those 3, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. And then finally, Shakespeare's Hamlet. And again, extra credit, read the complete works of Shakespeare, but just read Shakespeare's Hamlet. It is not that these are my favorite works, it's that these, I think, are the most solid foundation. You asked for a reading list. There it is. Go away and read them. Okay, awesome. Thank you for being here with me on this show. If you like this show, as I always say, you will love the work that I do for my employers at the Claremont Institute. They are very, very kind to let me do this side project with you. And we publish 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. Look us up online. Donate at claremont.org/donate. And we will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.